There's a certain confidence that comes with expertise, an assurance that risks can be taken without consequence. But nature plays by different rules. No one can truly be an expert in the wild, and those who claim to be often learn the hard way. Join us as we share stories of nature enthusiasts who believed they had mastered the wilderness only to become its prey. 2025, the air was brittle and cold, seeping through layers of clothing and biting at the skin no matter how tightly wrapped. The mountains of Hokkaido in February were a world apart, silent, heavy with snow, and indifferent to human presence. Aya, Emiko, and Hana had always sought places like this, where the earth still felt untamed and wild. They were experienced hikers, accustomed to the solitude and harsh beauty of winter treks, and they had prepared well, or so they believed. The trail they followed wound through towering firs and cedars, their branches sagging beneath thick layers of snow. The trio moved in rhythm, their boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. They had spent the day climbing to a ridge that overlooked a vast, unbroken forest, an expanse of white stretching endlessly below them. The view was breathtaking, the sight that made every shiver and ache worth it. By nightfall, they had made camp near a small clearing near a stream, where the sound of flowing water provided an eerie contrast to the wilderness's silence. They were careful but not meticulous. Their food was stored in bags but not far enough from the tent. The cold made them careless. Surely nothing would wander so close in such deep snow. Even the animals, they thought, would be huddled in dens, waiting for the first signs of spring. But hunger changes everything. In the vast stillness of the forest, a shadow moved. The Usuri brown bear had been wandering for days, a hulking mass of muscle and desperation, its ribs pressing against thick fur, its body weakened by the brutal winter. The usual food sources had grown scarce. The deep snows had driven smaller animals into hiding, and the frozen rivers had stolen its last chance at easy fish. It was not a season for survival. It was a season for starvation. Then it smelled something, faint but distinct, a promise of nourishment cutting through the icy air. The bear followed it, its breath heavy, nostrils flaring. The scent led it forward, down the slope, through the trees, until the glow of a small fire flickered through the darkness. The camp was quiet. The three women lay cocooned in their sleeping bags, the last embers of their fire casting long shadows against the walls of their tent. The bear hesitated at the edge of the clearing, ears twitching, eyes reflecting the weak moonlight. There was no movement, no threat, just the overwhelming scent of food. It lumbered forward, drawn by hunger so deep that it drowned out every instinct but the need to feed. The bags of provisions were torn open first, its powerful jaws ripping through the fabric, devouring whatever it could find, rice, dried fish, scraps of preserved meat. But it was not enough. Not nearly enough. Then the tent shifted, a muffled rustling from within. The bear's ears flicked forward and something primitive awoke inside it, a recognition buried deep in its blood. Food, the warmth of flesh. It lunged. The tent instantly collapsed, the fabric caving as the beast tore through it. The first scream never had a chance to reach the night. Clawed paws crushed bone and flesh before instinct could even give birth to escape. The bear's weight was unbearable, suffocating, its sheer force pinning the writhing body beneath it. The snow turned black with shadowed blood. In the chaos, another form struggled free, escaping into the open air, slipping, crawling, breathless. The bear swung its head, its maw slick with warmth, and followed. Once serene in its hush, the forest erupted into sound, frantic steps, crashing branches, the desperate gasp of breath against the cold. Aya ran, heart pounding, her body moving before her mind could form a thought. She could hear Emiko behind her, the stumbling rhythm of her flight echoing through the trees. But Hana was silent. The bear did not chase with speed. It moved with something worse, certainty. It was a creature of the mountains, built for this world in a way they never could be. The snow that swallowed their boots was nothing to it. It closed the distance with monstrous ease. A sudden impact sent Aya sprawling, her body crashing against the ice-coated earth. The force of the fall knocked the wind from her lungs, and the pain bloomed sharp and unrelenting. She tried to rise, but the weight returned, an unbearable pressure, a crushing force. The bear's jaws clamped down, and the iron taste filled the night. Emiko fought. There was no choice. A rock, a flailing arm, anything to drive the beast back. But a bear does not flinch at the struggles of the weak. Its hunger was a thing beyond pain, beyond hesitation. It lashed out, a single strike sending her body tumbling into the snow, limbs twisted, breath shuddering out in ragged, fading gasps. Then there was nothing but the sound of tearing, the crunch of bone, the slow, methodical feasting of a starving beast. By the time the sun rose, the snow had buried much of the horror beneath its quiet cover. Satisfied, the bear moved away from the remains, dragging the last scraps into the trees, a final act of instinct before sleep overtook it. Days passed before the world noticed their absence. Families called and messages went unanswered. Concern turned to panic, then to action. A search began, but the wilderness did not give up its dead so easily. It was not until a hunter moving through the dense woods in search of game stumbled upon something unnatural: scattered remains, the remnants of a camp torn apart, and tracks that told a story more brutal than words ever could. He followed them past where the snow had been stained and into the deep woods where the beast had vanished. When they found the bear, it was sluggish, its belly distended, its breath slow. The kill was swift, a single shot ending the cycle it had begun. When they cut it open, the truth lay waiting inside, a horror beyond confirmation. The authorities spoke of misfortune, of mistakes made in the cold, the scent of food left unguarded, a desperate bear pushed beyond the edge of reason. But nature does not operate on reason. It does not consider fairness or cruelty. It only moves forward, indifferent, its rhythm unbroken by the lives lost. The snow fell again that night, gentle, unknowing, and the tracks had disappeared by morning. 2025 John Harris spent a lifetime reading the wilderness, learning its signs, rhythms, and the unspoken language of the land. He had seen how winter gripped the Alaskan backcountry with an iron hand, how the wind carved ridges into the snow, and how the rivers lay silent beneath thick layers of ice, but never like this. In February, the national park in south-central Alaska was a vast and unforgiving frozen expanse of white silence. The park stretched millions of acres where the mountains swallowed sound and time felt meaningless. John had ventured here alone, as he had done many times before, trusting his instincts and years of experience. He had planned everything: his route, supplies, emergency beacons. But no plan could anticipate the wrong step, the unseen danger buried beneath the snow. His camp was in a small clearing near the base of a ridge, sheltered from the worst of the wind. He had built a fire pit, set up his tent, and stored his food away from camp, just as he always did. He had taken every precaution. After a quick meal, he strapped on his snowshoes and gathered more firewood that morning. Under the morning light, the land looked deceptively peaceful. The snow-covered ground stretched unbroken except for the skeletal remains of trees and the occasional rock outcrop. He moved methodically, his breath rising in white plumes, the axe's weight familiar in his gloved hands. He had done this 1,000 times before, but as he swung the axe against a thick fallen log, the ground beneath him gave a subtle tremor, something shifting deep below the snow. He felt it before he saw it, a deep vibration in the earth, something stirring where there should have been nothing. Then came the sound, a low, guttural exhalation, raw and ancient, carried on the cold air. The snow near a rocky overhang shifted and cracked, and something massive began to emerge from the darkness beneath it. The grizzly rose slowly, unsteady on its legs, fur matted with frost and dirt. Its eyes, small and sunken from months of hibernation, squinted against the daylight. John knew immediately what had happened. He had broken open a winter den and woken something that should not have been woken. His body reacted before his mind fully processed it. He took a step back, then another, hands trembling even as he kept his movements slow. The bear sniffed the air, its breath steaming in the cold, its body swaying slightly. It was confused, sluggish, not yet fully aware of what had roused it. But instinct ran deep in animals like this, and John knew hunger would soon override disorientation. He turned, moving carefully at first, then faster. But in his rush, he never saw the thin crust of ice hiding the drop beneath his feet. The snow collapsed, and before he could react, he was falling. He hit hard, his body tumbling down the narrow crevasse. The world spun, and then just as suddenly it stopped. His right leg had caught beneath a rock, wedging him in place. Pain shot through his body, sharp and immediate. He gasped, blinking up at the narrow slit of the sky above. For long minutes he fought to free himself, twisting, pulling, trying to shift the rock that pinned him. But the ice beneath his back was slick, and his strength meant nothing against the weight trapping his leg. The bear remained above. It had wandered forward, standing at the edge of the crevasse, peering down with dark, unreadable eyes. John barely dared to breathe, but the bear did not come for him. Instead, it turned away, shuffling off into the trees. Hours passed. He was no stranger to pain, but this was different. The cold was leaching into him now, creeping into his bones. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to think. His emergency beacon was in his pack, at camp, too far away to reach. He had his knife, but it was useless here. He tried again to free his leg, pushing, straining, his breaths coming ragged and fast, but the rock didn't budge. As the day faded into the evening, the temperature plummeted. His body ached from the cold, from exhaustion. He focused on breathing, on staying awake. But the cold had a way of dulling the senses, of making surrender seem easy. Then, sometime deep in the night, he heard it again. The low, rumbling exhale, the shuffle of heavy paws on snow. The bear had returned. It moved cautiously, as if uncertain. Its hunger had woken now, its instincts sharpening. It peered down into the crevasse, sniffing. Then, with terrifying ease, it began to climb down. John thrashed and fought, every nerve in his body screaming. He struck out, his hands clawing at the ice and walls. The bear's weight dislodged loose snow, sending small cascades onto him. It was too close. Its breath was hot and foul, its fur dusted with ice crystals. Then came the pull. Teeth clamped onto his coat, jerking him forward. His leg twisted, the pain unbearable, but the rock gave way. He was dragged back into the open air, out of the crevasse. He fought, kicked, and tried to free himself, but the bear's strength was beyond anything human resistance could match. The world became a blur of movement and pain. His body slammed against the snow, his vision flashing with the force of each impact. Claws raked over him, cutting through the fabric, through the skin. The bear's weight crushed him. Each breath a struggle against the press of muscle and fur. Pain lanced through his side, hot and immediate. He felt the wet warmth of blood, the sharp agony of tearing flesh. His body spasmed, his limbs moving without thought, without direction. But there was no escaping it. The bear was everywhere, its jaws, claws, the sheer weight of it. Somewhere in the chaos, he felt himself weakening. The fight in him, so fierce at first, began to ebb. His body, broken and bloodied, no longer answered his will. The world blurred, the sky fading into nothing but a pale haze. And then there was nothing. Days later, the search team found what remained of him. Snow had begun to cover the ground where it had happened, but the signs were still there. The deep furrows in the earth, the scattered remains of gear, the unmistakable marks of a struggle. The bear was found nearby, still lingering in the area. Wildlife officials made the decision quickly. A grizzly that had tasted human blood could not be left to roam. The shot echoed through the trees, a single crack that shattered the silence. The wilderness had taken John Harris, as it had many before him. The search team carried his body, the weight of his final journey resting heavily on it. Soon the snow would come again, covering the last traces of what had happened. The mountains would remember, as they always did, but they would never tell. It was August 2024, and the sun hung low over the Lamar Valley, casting a golden glow across the wide expanse of sagebrush and scattered pines. The river flowed steadily, its surface glinting in the late afternoon light, whispering as it curved through the valley. It was a perfect day, warm but not stifling, the air alive with the distant calls of birds and the occasional rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. 13-year-old Lily Thompson moved ahead with an eager bounce, her hiking boots pressing into the soft dirt along the riverbank. She had always loved the outdoors, and with its untamed beauty, the national park in the northwest corner of Wyoming felt like a world away from the noise of home. Jennifer, her mother, walked a few paces behind, watching her daughter with quiet amusement. She was cautious, always scanning their surroundings, but there was no real sense of danger, just the peaceful hum of the wild. They had spent the afternoon meandering along the river, pausing to skip stones and marvel at the sheer vastness of the land. Lily was interested in the animal tracks that crisscrossed the muddy banks. Deer, elk, and even what looked like wolf prints. Each imprint is a silent reminder of the creatures that called this place home. It felt like an adventure, a chance to step into something raw and untamed. Then, just as they rounded a bend, Jennifer saw it. A grizzly, massive and heavy with muscle, stood near the water's edge, its thick fur blending deep brown and sunlit gold. It was rummaging through the river stones, perhaps searching for fish, its powerful claws easily raking the pebbles aside. A moment later, the movement behind it confirmed Jennifer's fear. Two small cubs, their fur still slightly shaggy, clumsily nosing around near their mother's legs. Jennifer's pulse quickened. The bear hadn't noticed them yet. It was focused on its task, with its head down relaxed, but that could instantly change. Instinct took over as Jennifer reached for Lily, gripping her wrist and slowly stepping back. She kept her movements controlled and her breathing steady, doing exactly what she had read in every safety guide. No sudden movements, no panic. But Lily hesitated, her eyes locked on the bear with fascination and fear. Her sudden stiffness sent a shiver of tension through Jennifer's body. And then it happened. A rock, dislodged by Lily's heel, tumbled down the slope and struck another with a sharp clack. The bear's head snapped up at this, and it charged. It closed the distance fast, crashing through the underbrush. Jennifer barely reacted before it slammed into her, knocking her to the ground. Lily's scream barely escaped before a massive paw struck her side. The blow sent her tumbling toward the riverbank, the impact driving air from her lungs. Then the thick claws gripped her jacket. The world tilted as she was dragged toward the river, her hands scrabbling against dirt, grasping at rocks, roots, anything. The bear was too strong. Its breath was hot, thick with the scent of earth and decay. Jennifer was already up, scrambling forward, desperate, clawing at the bear's flank. Her hands beat against the beast's thick fur, her nails digging in, trying everything. But it was like hitting a wall of muscle. The bear barely reacted. Lily's body twisted as she kicked, her boots slamming against the animal's snout. It only made things worse. The bear snarled, its jaws flashing down, clamping onto her shoulder. Pain exploded through her as she was lifted, her small frame flailing helplessly. Jennifer lunged, grabbing her daughter's legs and pulling with everything she had. The river roared behind them, and for a brief moment there was a horrible tug-of-war, Jennifer pulling one way, the bear the other. Then the bear gave a vicious shake. Lily's scream cut through the valley. Jennifer lost her grip. She watched horror as the bear spun, dragging Lily straight into the river. Water exploded around them, sending ripples through the current. Jennifer stumbled forward, plunging into the freezing water, her hands reaching and grabbing. But the bear was relentless. It pinned Lily beneath its weight, her small body thrashing wildly. The river churned red. Jennifer fought, her arms crashing against the bear's back, her fingers digging, her screams lost in the roar of water and wind. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. But the bear did not yield. It was nature, raw and merciless, unmoved by her desperation. Lily's struggles weakened. Her head slipped beneath the surface. The river carried them both farther, deeper. Jennifer lunged again, her fingers brushing her daughter's jacket, but it was too late. The current took her, pulling her limp body downstream. Jennifer collapsed onto the bank, gasping and shaking. Satisfied, the bear turned and lumbered back toward its cubs. It was over. The world felt impossibly still. Somewhere, the wind continued whispering slowly through the grass. The river moved uncaring, smoothing its surface as if nothing had happened. Birds still called from the trees, their songs unchanged and unbroken. It was hours before help arrived. The search team scoured the river, but they already knew the outcome. When they found Lily's body tangled among the rocks, her jacket torn, her skin pale beneath the fading light, the truth settled like a weight no one could lift. Jennifer sat on the bank, staring at the water. The memory of her daughter's last moments burned into her mind. The park rangers spoke in hushed tones, their faces grim, but their words barely registered. Nothing could undo what had happened. Nothing could reverse the brutal indifference of the wild. The bear was tracked the next morning and shot by authorities. A necessary act, they said, but Jennifer knew it didn't matter. The valley would go on, just as it always had, just as it always would. The river would still run, the wind would still whisper, and somewhere, another mother bear would lead her cubs down to the water's edge. But her daughter can never be alive again. 2024, a zoo in San Diego was alive with the sounds of families, the chatter of children, and the occasional squawk of exotic birds. October had brought a crispness to the air, a slight chill that made the day comfortable beneath the golden California sun. Heather Davis strolled with her family, her camera swinging from its strap as she took in the sights. It had been years since she had visited a zoo, and the experience felt different now. Walking alongside her husband and children, watching them marvel at creatures they had only seen in books or on screens. Many loved the polar bear exhibit, a sprawling habitat designed to mimic the icy landscapes of the Arctic. It featured towering artificial rock formations, a large pool of clear blue water, and patches of faux snow. The bears, 2 adult males, were enormous, living testaments to the power and resilience of nature. Visitors often gathered along the thick glass barrier, pressing their hands against it, thrilled when the bears wandered close. Heather paused near the edge of the viewing platform, positioning herself for a photo. The ledge where she stood was slightly elevated, and many visitors leaned in for a better angle. The concrete surface was almost too smooth, and her shoe slipped when she shifted her weight to adjust her footing. It happened too fast for her to react. One moment she was steady, camera in hand. The next, gravity took hold. Her body pitched forward, her arms flailing desperately to catch herself. But there was nothing to grip, nothing to break the fall. She tumbled over the barrier, the world tilting as she plunged onto the rocky terrain of the enclosure. The impact sent a jolt through her body, pain flaring in her shoulder as she hit the ground hard. For a second she lay there, stunned, the breath knocked from her lungs. Then reality slammed into her with a force far worse than the fall. She was inside the enclosure. Above, voices erupted into panic, gasps, shouts, and people pointing. The world beyond the glass was a blur of movement, but everything was eerily still inside. The only sounds were the artificial stream's distant trickle and the water's rhythmic lapping against the rocks. And then, the bears noticed her from the far end of the habitat. The first one lifted its massive head, dark eyes locking onto her, and the second bear followed suit. They weren't rushing toward her, not yet, but they were moving, their enormous bodies shifting, muscles rippling beneath thick white fur. Heather scrambled to her knees, heart hammering. She had to get out, fast. The barrier was too high to climb, but the ledge she had fallen from wasn't far. If she could reach it, if she could just... A shadow passed over her. The first bear had closed the distance in a fraction of a second. It loomed above her, its sheer size impossible to comprehend up close. Although it had looked majestic on the viewing platform, almost slow in its movements, here, face to face, it was something else entirely. Ancient, built for survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The bear huffed, lowering its massive head, nostrils flaring again. It was curious, investigating. But curiosity about this powerful animal could turn lethal in an instant. Heather barely had time to react before the bear moved. A swipe, fast and effortless, knocked her backward. Pain exploded across her side as claws met flesh, tearing through fabric, leaving a searing burn in their wake. The force alone sent her sprawling onto the rocks, her limbs weak, struggling to respond. A thin crimson streak bloomed across her side, the wound deep but not enough to immobilize her. But the bear wasn't finished. It pressed forward, its bulk shifting, and a low, rumbling sound reverberated from its chest. Heather tried to crawl backward, pushing with her feet, but the terrain was uneven and jagged. Her hands scraped against the rough stone, and her fingers slipped as she fought to gain traction. The second bear was watching now, standing near the water's edge. It hadn't joined in yet, but its posture was alert, its focus sharp. Zoo staff rushed into action above. A loud alarm blared, sending animals retreating into their enclosures. Heather could hear voices shouting and sense movement beyond the glass, but she couldn't focus. The bear was too close. It reared up slightly, shifting its weight, assessing her. Heather's mind screamed at her to move, to get away, but her body wasn't cooperating fast enough. The bear's paw lifted again. Then, something changed. A loud, sharp, and piercing noise cut through the chaos. A shot was fired into the air, not to kill, but to deter. The bear flinched, its attention snapping upward. Another bang. This time it backed away, its muscles tensed and its eyes darted toward the source of the sound. It hesitated, considered, and finally took a step back. Heather didn't waste the chance. Hands shaking, she pushed herself upright, every inch of her body screaming in protest. Someone had lowered a rope into the enclosure, and arms were reaching for her, desperate to pull her out. She stumbled toward them, her legs unsteady. Just as she reached the edge, another shot rang out, this one closer. The bear jerked backward, its paws skidding slightly on the rocks. Heather felt hands grip her arms, hoisting her up and pulling her out of the nightmare. The moment she was back on the other side, her body gave out. She collapsed onto the ground, her breathing ragged, pain radiating through her side and shoulder. Blood soaked into her clothes, warm and sticky. Someone was pressing something against the wound, voices urgent, but she could barely register them. The bears remained in their enclosure, pacing now, the momentary confusion giving way to a return to their normal routine. They hadn't attacked out of malice. They had only responded to what their instincts dictated. The zoo had designed their home to be as close to the Arctic wild as possible, and in that moment, they had simply behaved as they would in the wild. Heather was rushed to the hospital, her body battered but alive. The wounds on her side were deep, requiring multiple surgeries, but she had survived. News of the attack spread quickly, headlines capturing the moment's horror. Experts weighed in, discussing the unpredictable nature of wild animals, even in captivity. The zoo reinforced the viewing area, making changes to prevent future incidents. But the polar bears remained untouched by the chaos they had caused, continuing their lives as they always had, unaware of the fragile human world beyond the glass. In June 2024, the vast wilderness of Kamchatka stretched endlessly before Natalia Ivanova. In this land, towering volcanoes loomed over valleys of thick forest, and icy rivers cut through the rugged terrain. Natalia had always found solace in places like this, far from the city's noise and the confinement of walls and schedules. She had hiked many trails across Russia, but Kamchatka held a special place in her heart. Something almost sacred about its isolation was the way the land felt raw and unbroken. She had been trekking for hours, her boots pressing firm into the mossy ground, the weight of her backpack familiar on her shoulders. Occasionally she paused to take in the view, allowing herself to be swallowed by the sheer magnitude of the wilderness. She decided to rest in one such moment of stillness, settling onto a flat rock overlooking a vast valley. Pulling out her phone, she was surprised to find a weak signal, rare in these parts, a fleeting connection to the outside world. Without hesitation, she called her husband Sergei back in St. Petersburg. The moment his voice filled her ears, a smile touched her lips. She described the view, the sweeping mountain ridges painted in the soft light of the late afternoon sun, the way the mist curled along the peaks, and the comforting and humbling silence. She could hear the warmth in his voice as he listened, a distant thread connecting them across the vastness of Russia. She was so focused on their conversation, on the simple pleasure of sharing this moment with him, that she didn't notice the shift in the air behind her. Deep in the forest, something moved, silent, deliberate. A presence slipping through the shadows, unnoticed in its approach. The Russian grizzly bear had been watching her for some time, its massive form blending into the dense greenery, its dark eyes locked onto the lone figure perched on the rock. It moved with eerie stillness, its powerful muscles rolling beneath thick fur, its enormous paws pressing soundlessly into the earth. The wind masked its scent, carrying it away before Natalia could sense the danger. Then, with terrifying speed, it closed the distance. Natalia only realized something was wrong when the hairs on her neck prickled, a sudden instinctive awareness that she was no longer alone. The feeling was immediate and suffocating, an invisible weight settling onto her chest. She turned. The bear was upon her. A wall of fur, muscle, and sheer brute force erupted from the undergrowth like a real nightmare. Her breath caught, a shockwave of terror surging through her veins. She scrambled backward, her pulse hammering against her ribs. But there was no time to react, no time to think. The bear struck. The impact was unlike anything she had ever felt. It was a force so immense that it sent her crashing onto the uneven ground, her phone slipping from her grasp and tumbling onto the moss. Her limbs flailed as she tried to push herself away, and her breath came in ragged gasps. But the bear was relentless. A massive paw slammed down, claws raking across her jacket, tearing through fabric like paper. Pain shot through her body, sharp and electric. She kicked, twisted, and fought against the weight crushing her down, but the bear was overpowering, an unshakable force of nature. Her screams cut through the stillness, raw and desperate, echoing through the valley, carrying into the void. Her phone, still connected, lay just inches away, Sergei's voice lost in the chaos. The bear's jaws clamped down. Agony ripped through her as teeth pierced flesh, locking onto her shoulder and dragging her like a rag doll. Her body spasmed, hands clawing at the earth, nails breaking as she struggled. Blood soaked into the ground beneath her, the scent of iron thick in the air. She fought, her survival instincts thrashing against the inevitable. Her wild, primal determination surged. But the bear showed no mercy. It shook her violently, her vision blurring with its sheer force. Her mind screamed for air, for escape, for anything but this. The phone crackled, Sergei's voice a distant ghost, unheard beneath the snarls and gasps. Then the device slipped into silence as the call was cut off. The struggle slowed. Her limbs weakened. The pain became distant, her senses dulling as her body failed her. The forest around her blurred, the towering trees bending and twisting, the sky above a vast, indifferent expanse. The bear did not stop. Long after her body had gone limp, long after her breath had faded into nothing, it remained, tearing into flesh, devouring. The wilderness knew no cruelty, no malice, only hunger, only survival. Hours later, rescue teams arrived. What remained of Natalia was barely recognizable, scattered remnants of a life once full of warmth and adventure, now reduced to silence. The bear was found the next morning, tracked down and euthanized. This decision was necessary, a reminder that Kamchatka's beauty was not without its dangers. Sergei never recovered from the sound of that final call. It haunted him, the helplessness of listening to her last moments, unable to reach her, unable to save her. Kamchatka remained unchanged, its mountains standing tall, its rivers flowing undisturbed. The wind carried no memory of what had transpired. The land continued as it always had and would. 2024, the August air on Kodiak Island carried the scent of damp earth, mixing with the musk of spruce trees and the lingering chill of the northern Pacific. The coastline stretched endlessly, waves crashing against jagged rocks in a rhythm as old as the land itself. Thomas Reed moved steadily along a narrow trail, his boots pressing into the damp soil, each step measured against the uneven terrain. His brother walked a few paces behind, their conversation light. The silence of the wilderness wrapped around them like a thick blanket. The remoteness of the place was striking. There was no hum of distant roads, no signs of civilization, just the wind and the slow creak of tree limbs shifting in the breeze. They had been hiking for hours, following a well-worn path that hugged the coastline, occasionally opening up to breathtaking water views. A bald eagle had soared overhead earlier. Its wings spread wide as it rode the currents, scanning for fish below. It was easy to forget, in moments like these, how unforgiving the wild could be. The brothers were cautious, aware of where they were. Kodiak bears roamed these forests, their immense size making them the undisputed rulers of the island. They had read the warnings and seen the signs, and it was advice they took seriously. But after miles of empty trails and nothing but the occasional rustling of unseen animals, the anxiety had faded into the background. They didn't hear it at first. The sound was subtle, just the faintest shift of movement through the dense underbrush. A twig snapped, then another, but the wind carried the noise away before their minds could fully register it. 100 small sounds filled the forest at any moment, branches swaying, squirrels darting through the leaves, the distant rush of water. It was easy to dismiss. Then Thomas felt it. There was a deep instinctual awareness of being watched. There was a slow, creeping pressure as if the air had thickened around him. He stopped walking, his body suddenly rigid, every nerve on edge. His brother halted behind him, sensing the change in his posture. A massive and silent Kodiak bear emerged from the brush like a ghost. Its fur was the color of damp earth. Muscles rippled beneath its thick coat, and its sheer size was a breathtaking display of power. The bear wasn't charging or growling, it was just watching, assessing. For a moment neither man moved. The bear's dark eyes locked onto them, its head swaying slightly as it took in their presence. It had likely caught their scent long before they noticed it, drawn in by curiosity rather than aggression. But curiosity in a creature this large could turn dangerous instantly. Thomas knew what he needed to do. Slow movements, no sudden gestures, back away, give it space. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he kept breathing even, his muscles tight with controlled tension. Then his foot slipped. The rock beneath him shifted unexpectedly, sending his weight forward. His ankle twisted sharply, and he collapsed onto one knee before he could correct himself. The sudden motion shattered the fragile balance of the moment. The bear tensed, and its ears flattened, and then it charged. The speed was shocking. One moment it was still, the next it was closing the distance with terrifying force. Thomas barely had time to react before the impact knocked him flat. A massive paw swiped across his leg, shooting searing pain through him as claws tore through fabric and flesh alike. The force of the blow sent him rolling across the ground, his body slamming against the roots of a nearby tree. His mind blurred with the shock of it, but instinct kept him moving. He twisted, trying to push himself up, but the pain in his leg sent a brutal jolt through his body. The bear loomed over him, towering like something out of a nightmare, its breath heavy and thick with the scent of wet fur and raw earth. His brother was already moving. A thick branch lay nearby, half buried in the undergrowth, and he grabbed it, his body coiled with desperation. The bear focused on Thomas, its weight shifting as it prepared to strike again. Then the stick came down hard, slamming against its shoulder with a dull thud. It wasn't a fatal blow, not even close, but it was enough. The bear flinched, a deep huff escaping its throat as it approached the new threat. The stick came down again, waving aggressively, the space between them and the bear widening slightly. The animal hesitated, its mind warring between instinct and uncertainty. Then it backed off, not in fear or defeat, but in quiet calculation. It huffed once more, its massive chest rising and falling, then turned, melting back into the underbrush with the same eerie silence with which it had appeared. The brothers didn't move for several long moments. The only sound was the distant crash of waves, the wind filtering through the trees. The world had continued, indifferent to the violence that had just unfolded. Thomas gritted his teeth as he shifted, the wound in his leg burning, blood soaking through his pants. It wasn't deep enough to be fatal, but bad enough. His brother was already moving toward him, steadying him as he pushed himself upright. They needed to move. The nearest cabin wasn't far, an old ranger shelter, abandoned for most of the year but still stocked with emergency supplies. Thomas gritted his teeth as he forced himself forward, his weight unsteady, his muscles screaming with each step. His brother supported him, half carrying him over the uneven terrain. By the time they reached the shelter, the pain had settled into a dull, persistent throb, his body exhausted from the adrenaline crash. The cabin was simple, 4 walls, a roof, nothing more, but it was shelter. His brother dug through the emergency supplies, finding bandages, gauze, and anything to stop the bleeding. As Thomas sat there, his breathing slowing and his body aching, the reality of what had happened settled over him. It had been avoidable. With a few more precautions, more noise, more awareness, the encounter might never have escalated. But that was the nature of the wild. It did not follow human rules and did not yield to expectations. It simply existed, vast and untamed, indifferent to the presence of those who wandered too close. By morning, his leg would still ache, and his body would still bear the marks of the encounter. But the island would go on, untouched by their moment of fear. Somewhere, deep in the forest, the bear would move along its path as it always had. And in the end, the wilderness would remember nothing, but they would remember everything.